The next step is the login form, which requires a bit more. The design of the login UI varies dramatically, and in both cases, it wasn't great. So I ended up taking a great deal of creative liberty in my interpretation on how this should look. There are a lot of things I chose to change about the UI. Most of them are due to taste and personal preference. I tried to make the code as close as possible so I would reuse more of it, but I still wanted to show how I can create very different UIs for very different platforms. For instance, this is the iOS version running on a tablet. You will notice I copied a lot of the UI, but you will also notice I took some inspirations from Android. I made sure to get everything working in landscape. Notice I took a very different approach to the UI in landscape that I think looks much better than the native version, which frankly looks awful. Notice that in the iPad version, in the clone, I don't move the title image. It doesn't move to the side like it does in other platforms when shifting to landscape. I also ignored the top area with more functionality and languages. It doesn't exist on iOS and didn't strike me as too important. Since the login form is a complex form, I chose to create a new class. For that, I also chose to create a new package, com.coname1.fbclone.forms. This class is a bit big, but before I get into it, I'd like to explain how I implemented this UI in the iOS version. What we see here are two text fields grouped together, so the first and the last have rounded look while entries in the middle, which we don't have here, would not. This is a common look in iOS, although it has gone somewhat out of fashion. In Coname 1, we can apply that look using the component group class. This class is a box layout container that automatically assigns special UI IDs to components, so the first component would be group element first, the second would be group element, and the last would be group element last. Notice that there is also a special UI ID for buttons added to the group. We don't use it in this case, so that's just an FYI. The iOS theme includes styling for these elements. They include rounding on the top of the first element and rounding on the bottom for the last element. On Android, this design paradigm is uncommon. As a result, there is no styling for these elements on Android. A group layout acts as a regular box layout container on Android and doesn't change the natural styling of the elements. This works seamlessly because the native iOS theme has a theme constant, component group bool. If it is set to true, that means the UI ID should be changed. Component group bool is only defined on iOS and defaults to false elsewhere. In the code, I use that theme constant to decide whether to show the Android UI or the iOS UI. Let's get into the code first, the class, variables, and method declarations. The logo is pretty much the same value we saw for the splash screen. It doesn't have to be the same though. Email and password are just standard input fields. The following buttons exist in the iOS and Android UIs, although the sign up button has different text in the Android version. The login form uses border layout so we can place the content where we want. Without the UI ID, the toolbar would appear on the top of the screen. Container is transparent with zero padding margin, which hides the toolbar. We set the name of the logo so the logo from the splash screen will animate into place due to the morph transition. We're placing the logo on the top of the screen in the center. Notice I used the login title to set the background around the logo. We are on a phone. If we are on a phone, I want the logo container to shift to the right side of the screen, when rotating to landscape. This is handled automatically by border layout. If we have component group support, I'll show the iOS style UI. I prefer this to testing whether this is iOS, since other platforms might choose to apply that look. We place the UI in the absolute center, so it's in the middle of the content. We wrap the button and component group in a box layout on the Y-axis, so they stick together in the center. The login and password go into the component group, and the login button is placed below. The padded container UI ID allows us to create some white space around the components so they don't stick to the edges when running in a phone. I add the content pane to the center of the UI so it will take up the available space. We place the two sign-up buttons on the bottom of the UI. The Android version is far simpler. We place the components in a box layout Y and tweak a few UI IDs/texts. And finally, this hides the status bar line on the top of the form and lets the image occupy the space. The status bar appears on top of the toolbar and grabs space to push down the content to leave space for the iPhone X notch and iOS clock, etc. It's a feature of iOS only. One item I skimmed over when reviewing the iOS look code is why we needed the content container. We could have just used the form, which is already in border layout, and just changed it to use center behavior, center absolute. That would have worked for portrait, but not for landscape. Since south takes up the space below east and west, it would have produced this image, which isn't what we want. The next big thing is setting the CSS values. Before I go into the new UI IDs, we'll start with one change to the existing CSS selector. This allows the buttons in Android to appear in all caps. These are the UI IDs that should be considered as buttons. Since the button class is very common, we don't apply the caps behavior to all buttons by default. If the UI ID isn't button, we need to explicitly declare that we are interested in the text becoming uppercase. Notice that this will only apply to platforms where buttons are caps to begin with. So if we use blue text on iOS, it won't be capitalized. Before we go into the full set of CSS changes, here is a map of the UI IDs I'll mention. You can reference this map if something isn't clear when I review the code. We need to add the following to the CSS file to support all the new UI IDs. There is quite a lot of code here. This automatically adds the file to the resources. The login banner is this JPEG, which you should place in CSS/images in your project. By default, the plugin adds multi-images where we can specify the DPI of the source image. By setting the DPI to 0, I state that I want a regular image. Multi-images are great, but for background, that would be scaled to fill anyway. The pixel perfect scaling of multi-images will probably be wasted. Multi-images take extra space in the resource file and thus in RAM. JPEG is especially efficient in terms of size, and for relatively large background images, it can be the ideal option. The title image fills available space, which should look decent regardless of the resolution of this type of image. I use a pretty big padding value to give the title area space in both orientations, so the image background will show. We shouldn't change the container UI ID, so I added this generic UI ID for spacing out the UI a bit. I use this as the base UI ID for buttons, as they have a lot of properties in common, such as center alignment, etc. I usually prefer to derive UI IDs from my own style and avoid deriving from built-in UI IDs, as those might change in unpredictable ways. We derive the base button UI ID. We customize the background color and use a round rect for the border. This pattern repeats in almost all of the following UI IDs. The default text hint looked bad, so we need to customize it to have better font, padding, etc. This is the text that appears before we type in the text field. Additional padding is needed in the text field and group elements to make them fit better into the UI. With these changes, we are nearly done. There is just one last change to make this all work. We just create and show the login form for now, no extra logic. With that, we can run the code and see the UI running. Next, I'll continue with the sign-up process.